Hello, this is chapter 1 of Elie Wiesel's Night. They called him Moishi the Beetle, as if his entire life he had never had a surname. He was the jack of all trades in a Hasidic house of prayer, a shitbul. The Jews of Saget, the little town in Transylvania where I spent my childhood, were fond of him. He was poor and lived in utter penury. As a rule, our townspeople, while they did help the needy, did not particularly like them. Moishi the Beetle was the exception. He stayed out of people's way. His presence bothered no one. He had mastered the art of rendering himself insignificant, invisible. Physically, he was as awkward as a clown. His waif-like shyness made people smile. And as for me, I liked his wide, dreamy eyes, gazing off into the distance. He spoke little. He sang, or rather he chanted, and the few snatches I caught here and there spoke of divine suffering, of the Shekinah in exile, where, according to Kabbalah, it awaits its redemption linked to that of man. I met him in 1941. I was almost 13 and deeply observant. By day I studied Talmud, and by night I would run to the synagogue to weep over the destruction of the temple. One day I asked my father to find me a master who could guide me in my studies of Kabbalah. "You're too young for that." Maimonides tells us that one must be 30 before venturing into the world of mysticism, a world fraught with peril. First, you must study the basic subjects, those you are able to comprehend. My father was a cultured man, rather unsentimental. He rarely displayed his feelings, not even with his family, and was more involved with the welfare of others than with that of his own kin. The Jewish community of Siget held him in highest esteem. His advice on public and even private matters was frequently sought. There were 4 of us children: Hilda, the eldest, then Bea. I was the third and only son. Zipporah was the youngest. My parents ran a store. Hilda and Bea helped with the work, and as for me, my place was in the house of study. Or so they said. "There are no Kabbalists in Siget," my father would often tell me. He wanted to drive the idea of studying Kabbalah from my mind. In vain. I succeeded on my own in finding a master for myself in the person of Moishi the Beetle. He had watched me one day as I prayed at dusk. "Why do you cry when you pray?" he asked, as though he knew me well. "I don't know," I answered, troubled. I never asked myself that question. I cried because something inside me felt the need to cry. That was all I knew. "Why do you pray?" he asked after a moment. Why did I pray? Strange question. Why did I live? Why did I breathe? "I don't know," I told him, even more troubled and ill at ease. "I don't know." From that day on, I saw him often. He explained to me with great emphasis that every question possessed a power that was lost in the answer. Man comes closer to God through the questions he asks him, he liked to say. Therein lies true dialogue. Man asks and God replies, but we don't understand his replies. We cannot understand them, because they dwell in the depths of our soul and remain there until we die. The real answers, Eliezer, you will find only within yourself. "And why do you pray, Moishi?" I asked him. "I pray to the God within me for the strength to ask him the real questions." And we spoke that way almost every evening, remaining in the synagogue long after all the faithful had gone, sitting in the semi-darkness where only a few half-burnt candles provided a flickering light. One evening I told him how unhappy I was to be able to find in Siget a master to teach me the Zohar, the Kabbalistic works, the secrets of Jewish mysticism. He smiled indulgently. After a long silence, he said, There were 1,001 gates allowing entry into the orchard of mystical truth. Every human being has his own gate. He must not err and wish to enter the orchard through a gate other than his own. That would present a danger not only for the one entering, but also for those who are already inside. And Moishi the beetle, the poorest of the poor of Saget, spoke to me for hours on end about the Kabbalah's revelations and its mysteries, and thus began my initiation. So who's Moishi? He's an outsider, right? He's on the periphery of this community. He's poor. He's described as waif-like, small. He might not be taken very seriously. And yet, he is the person our writer confides in, chooses to use as a religious teacher, to bounce their ideas, their thoughts off of. Together, we would read over and over again the same page of the Zohar, not to learn it by heart, but to discover within the very essence of divinity. And in the course of those evenings, I became convinced that Moishi the beetle would help me enter eternity, into that time when question and answer would become one. And then, one day, all foreign Jews were expelled from Sighet, and Moishi the beetle was a foreigner. Crammed into cattle cars by the Hungarian police, they cried silently. Standing on the station platform, we too were crying. The train disappeared over the horizon, and all that was left was thick, dirty smoke. Behind me, someone said, sighing, "What do you expect? That's war." The deportees were quickly forgotten. A few days after they left, it was rumored that they were in Galicia, working, and even that they were content with their fate. If you're annotating your physical copy, you can write in this. This is an important part to note. The part where it says behind me and ends with their fate. This is a theme that's found throughout his memoir, right? The act of denial, the act of willful ignorance, and how much that affects him in the long run and his community. Days went by, then weeks and months. Life was normal again. A calm, reassuring wind blew through our homes. The shopkeepers were doing good business. The students lived among their books, and the children played in the streets. One day, as I was about to enter the synagogue, I saw Moishi the beetle sitting on a bench near the entrance. He told me what had happened to him and his companions. The train with the deportees had crossed the Hungarian border and, once in Polish territory, had been taken over by the Gestapo. The train had stopped. The Jews were ordered to get off and onto waiting trucks. The trucks headed towards a forest. There, everybody was ordered to get out. They were forced to dig a huge trench. When they had finished their work, the men from the Gestapo began theirs. Without passion or haste, they shot their prisoners, who were forced to approach the trench one by one and offer their necks. Infants were tossed into the air and used as targets for the machine guns. And this was not just in our writer's case. So our writer, this was being described to Elie, right, by Moishi. But you read about these similar stories in other texts, that officers, that Gestapo, that German soldiers would use babies throw them in the air and use them as targets, essentially. This took place in the Galician forest, near Colomé. How had he, Moishi the beetle, been able to escape? By a miracle. He was wounded in the leg and left for dead. Day after day, night after night, he went from one Jewish house to the next, telling his story and that of Malka, the young girl who lay dying for 3 days, and that of Toby, the tailor who begged to die before his sons were killed. Moishe was not the same. The joy in his eyes was gone. He no longer sang. He no longer mentioned God or Kabbalah. He spoke only of what he had seen. But people not only refused to believe his tales, they refused to listen. Some even insinuated that he only wanted their pity, that he was imagining things. Others flatly said that he had gone mad. As for Moishe, he wept and pleaded, "Jews, listen to me. That's all I ask of you. No money, no pity, just listen to me." He kept shouting in synagogue between the prayer at dusk and the evening prayer. Even I did not believe him. I often sat with him after services and listened to his tales, trying to understand his grief. But all I felt was pity. "They think I'm mad," he whispered, and tears, like drops of wax, flowed from his eyes. Once I asked him the question, "Why do you want people to believe you so much? In your place, I would not care whether they believe me or not." He closed his eyes, as if to escape time. "You don't understand," he said in despair. "You cannot understand. I was saved miraculously. I succeeded in coming back. And where did I get my strength? I wanted to return to Sighet to describe to you my death so that you might ready yourselves while there's still time. Life? I no longer care to live. I am alone. But I wanted to come back to warn you. Only no one is listening to me." This was towards the end of 1942. Thereafter, life seemed normal once again. London radio, which we listened to every evening, announced encouraging news: the daily bombings of Germany and Stalingrad, the preparation of the Second Front. And so we, the Jews of Sighet, waited for better days that surely were soon to come. I continued to devote myself to my studies. Talmud during the day and Kabbalah at night. My father took care of his business in the community, and my grandfather came to spend Rosh Hashanah with us so as to attend the services of the celebrated Rebbe of Borsch. My mother was beginning to think it was high time to find an appropriate match for Hilda. Thus passed the year 1943. So our hero of this scene, of this chapter, Moishe, risked his life to come back to warn his community. And a community which he has always kind of been considered an outsider, right? He doesn't have any direct ties to these people. He just talked to them occasionally. He just befriended a few of them. And yet, he didn't just keep running, which he could have, which most of us would have done. I wouldn't have thought in the moment to go back, right? It would not have even occurred to me. And yet he did. He did, to warn his friends, to warn his community. And of course, they don't want to see it. Because if they admitted to themselves what was happening, it would completely disrupt their lives, right? And this is true today. We do this as a society. We are outraged to hear of something happening in the news, to something happening to maybe even people close to us. And then we forget about it 3 days later. And it's this willful ignorance, this willingness to just go along with things because it doesn't affect you directly. That's the problem in the memoir that our writer brings up over and over again. Spring 1944. Splendid news from the Russian front. There could no longer be any doubt. Germany would be defeated. It was only a matter of time, months or weeks perhaps. The trees were in bloom. It was a year like so many others, with its spring, its engagements, its weddings, and its births. The people were saying, The Red Army is advancing with giant strides. Hitler will not be able to harm us even if he wants to. Yes, we even doubted his resolve to exterminate us. Annihilate an entire people? Wipe out a population dispersed throughout so many nations? So many millions of people? By what means? In the middle of the 20th century? Possible. And thus my elders concerned themselves with all manner of things: strategy, diplomacy, politics, and Zionism, but not with their own fate. Even Moishe the beetle had fallen silent. He was wary of talking. He would drift through synagogues or through the streets, hunched over, eyes cast down, avoiding people's gaze. In those days, it was still possible to buy immigration certificates to Palestine. I had asked my father to sell everything, to liquidate everything, and to leave. So it's 1944. Our writer's probably 15 at this point. And even at 15, the age that some of you are, right? He has the capacity to understand fully what's happening around him, more so than his family does in this moment. He knows, like, he has to get out. And so he's begging his dad. He's begging his dad. "I am too old, my son," he answered. "Too old to start a new life. Too old to start from scratch in some distant land." Budapest radio announced that the fascist party had seized power. The regent Miklos Horthy was forced to ask a leader of the pro-Nazi nihilist party to form a new government. Yet, we still were not worried. Of course we had heard of the fascists, but it was all in the abstract. It meant nothing more to us than a change of ministry. The next day brought really disquieting news. German troops had penetrated Hungarian territory with the government's approval. Finally, people began to worry in earnest. One of my friends, Moishe Chaim Berkowitz, returned from the capital for Passover and told us, "The Jews of Budapest live in an atmosphere of fear and terror. Anti-Semitic acts take place every day, in the streets, on the trains. The fascists attack Jewish stores, synagogues. The situation is becoming very serious." The news spread through Sighet like wildfire. Soon, that was all people talked about. But not for long. Optimism soon revived. The Germans will not come this far. They will stay in Budapest. For strategic reasons. For political reasons. In less than 3 days, German army vehicles made their appearance on our streets. Anguish. German soldiers with their steel helmets and their death's head emblem. Still, our first impressions of the Germans were rather reassuring. The officers were billeted in private houses, even in Jewish homes. Their attitude towards their hosts was distant, but polite. They never demanded the impossible, made no offensive remarks, and sometimes even smiled at the lady of the house. A German officer lodged in the Khan's house across the street from us. And we were told he was a charming man, calm, likable, polite. 3 days after he moved in, he brought Mrs. Khan a box of chocolates. The optimists were jubilant. "Well, what did we tell you? You wouldn't believe us, and there they are, your Germans. What do you say now? Where's their famous cruelty?" The Germans were already in our town. The fascists were already in power. The verdict was already out. And the Jews of Sighet were still smiling. The 8 days of Passover. The weather was sublime. My mother was busy in the kitchen. The synagogues were no longer open. People gathered in private homes. No need to provoke the Germans. Almost every rabbi's home became a house of prayer. We drank, we ate, we sang. The Bible commands us to rejoice during the 8 days of celebration, but our hearts were not in it. We wished the holiday would end so as not to have to pretend. On the 7th day of Passover, the curtain finally rose. The Germans arrested the leaders of the Jewish community. Here we go. A week within occupation. Within a week, here come the restrictions. So we go from willfully denying that this could ever happen to this community to having it affect us directly. But unfortunately, at a moment when it's too late. From that moment on, everything happened very quickly. The race towards death had begun. First edict. Jews were prohibited from leaving their residences for 3 days under penalty of death. There's a pattern here. Moishe the beetle came running to our house. I warned you, he shouted, and then left without waiting for a response. The same day, the Hungarian police burst into every Jewish home in town. A Jew was henceforth forbidden to own gold, jewelry, or any valuables. Everything had to be handed over to the authorities under penalty of death. My father went down to the cellar and buried our savings. As for my mother, she went on tending to the many chores in the house, and sometimes she would stop and gaze at us in silence. 3 days later, a new decree. Every Jew had to wear the yellow star. Some prominent members of the community came to consult with my father, who had connections at the upper levels of the Hungarian police. They wanted to know what he thought of the situation. My father's view was that it was not all bleak, or perhaps he just did not want to discourage the others, to throw salt onto their wounds. The yellow star? So what? It's not lethal. Poor father. Of what then did you die? But new edicts were already being issued. We no longer had the right to frequent restaurants or cafes, to travel by rail, to attend synagogue, to be on the streets after 6 o'clock in the evening. Then came the ghettos. All right, I am going to stop there for part 1. As this chapter is a little longer, I'm going to break it up into 2 parts. You are only responsible for reading this first part, and we'll cover the second part tomorrow. That's a lot. It's going to get even more disturbing as he discusses what happens to him and his family. And we'll get into it. Sorry if you heard my cat in the background every once in a while. It's probably chewing on some plastic. All right, you guys. Have a good one.